Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Barron, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Barron.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Barron. Our producer is Jody Mayer-Piazza. Today, I want to talk about an important but little-known government agency that helps keep our voting systems up to date and honest. The U.S. Elections Assistance Commission has existed for a little over 20 years. It was created in the aftermath of the 2000 presidential election and the recount in Florida. In today's political climate of doubt and suspicion about voting and vote counting, the EAC plays an important role, which we're going to discuss. My guest is Commissioner Don Palmer. Mr. Palmer is one of the 4 EAC commissioners. He's a Navy veteran, having served 20 years as an intelligence officer and judge advocate general. Before his appointment to the Elections Assistance Commission, Don Palmer was the chief elections administrator in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and prior to that, he was director of elections in the state of Florida. He came to his current job, obviously, with extensive experience in election administration. Don Palmer, welcome to Early Returns.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for having me on to talk about this important issue. Appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. It's good to have you here. Well, I've given a little of your background to our audience, but why don't you share a little more about yourself, such as, where did you grow up and how did you wind up connecting to election administration as an avocation?
Well, growing up is a little bit easier to talk about. I'm a Floridian. I was born in St. Pete and went to high school in Orlando, Florida, and went to college and served some of my time in the Navy in Jacksonville, Florida. So I'm a Floridian seed and lived much here. How I got involved in election administration is a little bit more windy. I guess I've always been interested in law and politics and law and voting, but I was serving in the military and I was overseas and didn't really have a sense of what I would do. I was pretty much a criminal lawyer and tried cases in the criminal law, but I had this interest in voting. Once I got out of the military, I went to work with Congressman Feeney on the Hill to do the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act because I had, sort of an understanding of that area of the law in Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So that's where I started I went over to the voting section where I enforced some of the civil rights laws and the voting laws. And from there, I got a call from Florida to see if I was interested in making the transition to be their director of elections. And so that's how that started. Once you're in the business of election administrations, there are very few people leave. And so I got sucked into it. And so that's how that journey started into elections.
What was your biggest challenge in your career as an administrator? Was there one big controversy that distracted you or anything like that? Not that I want to bring up any sore points, but we haven't even discussed that. I was just curious.
I think, two of the challenges, I think first, right off, when I got to Florida, the Governor Christ, had decided that he wanted to transition from DREs to paper-based tabulators in an election year, be it 2008, the presidential primary and the presidential election. And, to make such a significant change in such a large state.
Explain to our audience what VRE stands for and what the difference is between the two voting systems that you just referenced.
So the DRE is a direct recording electronic. It's more of an electronic voting machine that may not have a paper audit trail. And, when I talk about a paper tabulator, it's more of a machine that you mark your ballot and you insert that into a voting machine, which will count your vote. And so one is more paper-based, obviously, and the governor and the legislature at the time decided to make this transition in a presidential year, which was a significant challenge to the entire team at the Department of State and to the local administrators. But we did it, and the election went off with a fault. But I would say the biggest challenge for any election administrator, particularly for me, was the statewide recount in Virginia for Attorney General. And it's a statewide recount, and it's such a exhausting process post-election, and there's such pressure and scrutiny to get the election results correct that I would just say that was extremely challenging and one that we got through. The courts gave us praise, and both candidates on both sides of the aisle did too. So I took that on board and was really appreciative of my team that we got through that process.
Well, when the Florida transitioned its voting systems, I gather that required buying new systems and installing them statewide. Was the EAC in existence at the time? Did it help in financing all of that?
Yeah, so it was quite the transition and implementation period. There's an acceptance testing, and there's a whole process in Florida where they also do independent testing of the machines at the time that were going to be offered for use in the state of Florida. HAVA grants were a significant part of the funding that the legislature used, so we could make that transition. And that was really the purpose of, and continues to be the purpose of, a lot of HAVA grants, because states want to transition from paperless systems or a DRE with a VPAP, with a paper trail, to a more traditional or more paper-based voting system. And so, yes, the HAVA grants, they really did help the state of Florida make that transition back in 2008.
Okay, so you've mentioned HAVA several times, and for our audience, that's the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which was the legislation that started the funding assistance for states to update and verify their voting systems. There's also the legislation that created the Election Assistance Commission. And the election that you're discussing here in Florida, that was a presidential election. Was that 2008 or 2012 when you were going through that?
That was 2008.
Then 2008. So HAVA had been passed. The EAC was around. You were not part of it at the time you were running the system in Florida. Tell our audience a little bit about how the EAC is structured and when it really began functioning. What are its mandates? What does it have to do?
So after the 2000 election, Congress established the EAC. It actually became a sister agency of the FEC. So they carved out that part and sort of strengthened it. The major purpose, from my perspective, HAVA, was it wanted the EAC to create minimal voting standards on a voluntary basis for manufacturers to test to and for states to use. So they wanted to raise the level of accuracy and security of the voting systems. And this is all the way back in 2002. And so that's a process of developing standards with NIST and the election community. So they created the EAC, and it created a testing and certification department, which would manage that process of testing to accredited labs and auditing accredited labs, and they would do the testing. There would be a department that would distribute the grants that the Congress determines to give to the states. So if it's the initial block of money was about $3.3 billion, if my memory serves, and there's been periodic grants that have been provided by the Congress. There was about a 10-year period where there were no grants. And then more recently, in the last 5 years, 6 years, there's been about $1.2 billion in different grants that the Congress has provided to the states. So the EAC was set up to do those primary functions, including an annual report and data collection and surveys from each federal election that the Congress wanted to see trends in election administration. And so they really established a whole new agency that could provide this information to the Congress. And when they created it similar to the FEC in that it's an independent bipartisan agency. So it's not a part of the executive branch. And I think that the Congress wanted to do that in the sensitive areas of elections and campaign finance, that wasn't controlled by the executive branch, but the Congress had a role to play in sort of the creation and the management of those agencies.
And when Congress decides to appropriate, as you've indicated, sometimes billions of dollars to make available to the states, who, by the way, under the law, the states run the elections. It's not the federal government. And each state decides how it's going to conduct its elections. It will have various rules as to what kind of voting will occur and whether there's absentee voting and early voting and all of that stuff. But the states and their localities are the place where the system actually gets created that enables citizens to choose their ballot candidates and then cast their vote to make sure that the vote gets counted. So Congress is appropriating billions of dollars of money. How does the money get distributed? Who decides which state gets money and for what purpose?
Well, it's really decided by a formula that's part of HAVA. And that formula is really, it's a non-competitive grant, and it's based on the voting age population. So every state is going to get a certain segment of money, an allocation of money from the funds that the Congress decides to appropriate. Now, some like that a lot. Some would rather be more competitive, but I think that got the most buy-in from the states. So it's sort of like a block grant. It's a really unique grant, and there's a lot of details to it that there's not a lot of grants in the federal government that are designed like it. So you could see that when the Congress was determining how they wanted these grants to go out to the states, they really did put their stamp on it as to recognizing the federalist system and the fact that elections are run at the state level. They put very few strings attached to it. They really sort of set out that we want to improve federal elections. We want to replace voting equipment, and we're not going to demand a lot from you, but those are the two areas that we want you to focus on.
So does the money usually get spent on updating voting equipment?
I would say that's a large part of it. Now it's sort of also infrastructure. So, a lot of states and localities will acquire electronic poll books. They will update their voter registration systems, because part of HAVA was to have a centralized database of voter registration that would be able to interact with localities. So there would be more communication that would help list maintenance and registration issues. Well, those are pretty expensive systems to create and maintain. And so a lot of HAVA funds have gone to updating those systems. They've gone to updating voting equipment, as you mentioned, and to generally increase the security of our voting process in all areas of the voting experience.
One of the controversies from the more recent election in 2020 was the private funding of election administration. The founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and his wife apparently provided several $100 million to be distributed to election administrators at the state and local level. And there was a great deal of debate as to whether that was appropriate, whether that had some improper connection in terms of the distribution of that funding, and whether it was provided to certain jurisdictions that might affect the outcome of the election in a partisan way. Does the EAC ever address private funding of election administration? Has it ever been offered, for example, hundreds of millions of dollars from Mr. Zuckerberg or anyone else to distribute to the states? What is the EAC's position, if any?
Well, I don't think we have a position, Jan. I think that, obviously we haven't received any funds at the EAC. And in my experience, both at the state level and working with localities, it really wasn't an option. It didn't seem like it was an option, even if there was a desire for it. We're usually provided state funds and instructions on how to use it with a budget. And for me to accept money from the outside would be kind of remarkable. But I think that there were some localities and states that, they had the ability to accept it, and they just felt that there was a big need for it. I'm very much a proponent and supporter of local, state, and federal funding of elections, because there's not a perception that, an outside influence is trying to influence our elections. And, I think that most folks, when they look at the issue, they're sympathetic to the needs of the administrators who may need additional resources. But the bottom line is if there were conservative or other millionaires or billionaires that were providing funds for specific causes within an office or a state involving elections, that raises a whole number of issues about influence and that sort of thing. And from my perspective, the best route is local, state, and federal resourcing of elections at an appropriate level. And there can be debates about that, but we have not received anything at the EAC, and we manage our grant process at the federal level, and we support the states. And I would say that many states do offer their own independent funding of localities to support them, as well as matching funds to the federal grants. So there is a lot of money in the field of election administration. They do need additional resource support, and that's what the debate has been over the last couple of years here, is how do we find a steady stream of resources, and how do we support the new standard, the VVSG 2.0? We have this next generation of voting systems, and how do we fund those how do we help localities acquire the new technology that will improve the security and accuracy of their voting process.
And that's kind of the second major mission of the Election Assistance Commission is, in addition to distributing grants and funding, you have a major role to play in testing and certifying equipment that's used in voting and to establish standards. You referenced a new standard. What's new about the new standard? I mean, what has changed from the last time you had a standard? And then we can discuss how do you go about testing the equipment?
Well, there's been a lot of change in the last 10 to 15 years with technology, and the goal really is to keep up and capture those technologies to improve our voting machines. And just like an aircraft may improve with technology, our voting systems, we've set new standards for the security of those standards and the auditability. So we make it easier for election officials to audit the voting machines or to use them in audits. The accuracy of the system's already very accurate, where you allow one error with 1.5 million ballots. Now it's like we allow one error in 10 million ballots. And so there's exponential increases in technology. And so you get a sense of we need to take this technology and develop the new systems and the new, the next generation of voting systems. And so we have set those standards. We have accredited labs, and we have a system in place that's being tested right now, the first one, with a few more that we believe will be coming into the labs. And so the goal is ultimately to provide some options to voters and to the administrators where they can have a number of systems to choose from of the new technological standards. And then the voters will have the benefit and the confidence in those new systems. And so that is a major function where we just completed that process. We make sure our labs are accredited, working with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and we work together to audit those labs. And so it's a voluntary process, so a lot of states, as you mentioned earlier, they have their own supplemental testing program, and localities and most local election offices will also conduct testing and acceptance testing of a voting system that they receive that's already been through a process. So you're correct.
What would be the most widely used voting system, if there is one, that's most used in the United States?
I think, there are a few large vendors. There's probably the top 3 vendors, but I think today that the ballot marking devices are increasing in their use. It's sort of a hybrid where you can mark a device, but then you tabulate the ballot. But I still think today the tabulators where you mark your ballot and you insert that paper ballot into a tabulator, I would guess that is still the most widely used form of voting across the country. And we do test those systems for accuracy. The high-speed tabulators, as you know, there's more and more mail voting. There might be ballots that are counted at the central office after an election. Well, all those tabulators and high-speed tabulators are tested at the EAC for accuracy and reliability. And so those are the primary areas that we are testing.
And those devices are really an outgrowth of a trend, I suppose, away from any devices that don't produce a paper ballot of some sort that can be preserved and retabulated. Is that correct? Folks want to make sure that when they vote, there's some physical evidence of what their vote was.
No, I think that's right. I mean, and HAVA basically lays that out, is that there needs to be some sort of audit capability, audit trail. And usually that's going to be a piece of paper that you could go back to and you can audit your election if you need to. You obviously need the ballots if you have a recount, but we want to be able to do audits even when it's not close enough for a recount. So you're correct on that. And there's been a growing movement away from the electronic voting because the technology is simply not there for an independent audit of a system that doesn't produce a piece of paper. The technology may be there one day, but it's not quite there yet. And so that's absolutely right. We're moving more toward paper. And I would say there's less than 7 states that still use only DREs, direct recording electronic machines. Most of the country is now using a paper-based system.
Well, we've come a long way from when I started voting, where we would have actually mechanical machines. You'd go into a voting booth, you'd pull a lever, to close the curtain behind you, and then you would just click on the machine to select the candidates you would like to vote for, and then you put the lever back, and there would just be a mechanical counter in the back of the machine that would preserve the votes. There's nothing to record your individual ballot. We've come a long way from those days. In 2020, there were allegations that some of the voting machinery was being corrupted or manipulated. In particular, there was a dispute or allegations, which are actually being litigated in court today, regarding systems created by a manufacturer named Dominion Voting Systems. Were those systems tested and certified by the EAC?
So they were. Dominion has been a long-time registered manufacturer, and so they've submitted at least 15 systems to the EAC over the years, since at least 2010 and maybe even earlier. And so there's different variants and different upgrades that they've provided over the years, but they are one of the major manufacturers in the country, and they have gone through our system of testing a number of times. And so they are definitely one of the manufacturers, and we did test their systems.
And when these allegations were made right after the 2020 election debated, the EAC make any public statements regarding their reliability? I mean, there were some pretty outrageous allegations that the vote was somehow manipulated from Venezuela or some foreign country and changed, which would require quite a feat. What did the EAC have to say about that?
So the EAC, some of the accusations were so fanciful that it's impossible to even respond to the impossibility of some of the allegations. But we tried to keep focused as a federal agency, and we made a press release and general statement immediately after the election supporting and defending the certification of all of our voting systems, including Dominion. We focused on the certification and security of that process, and that's been ongoing for 2 decades. And even prior to that, EAC, we had a formal testing program, but as you know, there was some testing, and there's obviously testing in the states that has occurred. So, we made a general statement supporting that and supporting our election officials. In December after the election, I was asked to testify at the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and they were examining irregularities in the 2020 election. And so a number of government officials, including those who had some accusations to make, testified. And so we obviously expressed confidence in our voting systems that we certify and the administrators. And so my testimony, I was just reviewing it the other day, and it was a tense time, but we basically stood behind the process of review and testing that we do at the EAC. And we had the opportunity to testify to that. And I think there were others that supported the EAC and the voting systems during that time.
Well, the fallout from that 2020 election, including the allegations about the Dominion voting equipment, is continuing. It's taking the form of a defamation case by the company against Fox News. There's even currently a trial scheduled for next month in April of 2023. Has the EAC been drawn into that litigation in any way?
Well, I think we get drawn in, but there's federal legal requirements that can keep a federal agency from getting too immersed in these things. And you probably understand the two-way response. That's sort of what's required of a federal agency when they're not part of the litigation, but they have information to provide to the court. And so we provided information on our testing program and the certification process, the standards development, all that in a two-way response. And that in that case, in the Dominion Fox case, and also for example, there's been litigation challenging the accreditation of our labs. And that was in Missouri federal court. And just recently, the court dismissed that case, and we had submitted a two-way response so the court would be aware of that program. So this is how I think the federal agencies provide information that we are doing what we're doing. You should have confidence in this process, and then you'll determine the facts between the two litigants. So we try to not take sides, but we think the court should have information on how we do business at the EAC.
Well, other voting activities, particularly those that were conducted during the pandemic, there were so many different changes in 2020 in almost all jurisdictions involving increased absentee voting, the use of drop boxes for ballots, ballot harvesting, disputes about signature matching, and so forth. Have any of those new voting activities or increased activities, does that affect the EAC's testing and certification process? I mean, as voting behavior changes, how does it affect your ability to examine the equipment and the way in which citizens vote?
So there's no real direct impact on testing and certification of voting machines because, the process is to test the tabulators that count the ballots to ensure the accuracy of the vote. So our goal is the confidence in the ballot totals. We as an agency do study and provide best practices in many policy areas. We have a clearinghouse department where Congress established, and they wanted us to provide best practices and to states and localities in different policy processes, such as some of the ones you mentioned. Our goal really, when you talked about the COVID response and sort of the CARES Act grants, our goal there was to support and assist the states as they adjusted to a pandemic, right? And that's a national emergency. We often support or try to support and prepare for hurricanes and tornadoes, and how do you continue to administer an election? Back during the pandemic, there was a lot of changes when it came to mail balloting or keeping our polling places clean and safe for folks. There was a lot of concern about that. So we focused a lot on keeping those processes safe and secure or adjusting to what would be increased mail ballots that were coming in. They had to be counted and tabulated, and the results had to be provided. So our goal is to assist the states as they had to make some adjustments in that election. And so that was really our role when it comes to those policy changes.
And in terms of other changes in voting practices and procedures, there's one new trend called ranked choice voting. This is just popping up in some local elections here and there, but there is a movement supporting this type of voting, which is somewhat novel. It is being used in a couple. I know the state of Maine uses it, for example, and it is a voting technique whereby the voter can indicate not only their first choice of a candidate, but also a second choice who would then be considered in tabulation if the first choice does not receive 50% of the vote in the initial count. It's a system of basically saying, well, we know who your first choice is, but that person really hasn't done very well among all the candidates. So we're dropping your first choice and taking into account who your second choice would be in retabulating the vote in order to come up with a winner without having a runoff election. That seems to me to present certain practical, technical challenges in voting systems. Am I right?
So there are some technical challenges in the voting systems. I mean, this is a real political or policy issue out there. I think that I can't speak for both sides, but I think part of the debate is do we want to get rid of runoffs and sort of that sort of thing, which can be expensive. But on the other hand, ranked choice voting can be somewhat complicated. So the EAC doesn't take, we try to be agnostic about the policy issues. If a jurisdiction wants to do it and a state wants to support them, or a manufacturer wants to support them, there may be a voting system change or software change that would allow them to make this process a bit more accurate, or to ensure accuracy. And so there are 3 systems that have had firmware that assist the election administrator, and they've gone through the testing process at the EAC. And so it's not often used in these voting systems, to be quite honest. As you said, there's only a number of counties and states that use it. But there are a number of manufacturers that have that as an option on their voting equipment. And we've taken a look and tested that to the standards. And again, we don't take a policy on the debate over it, whether or not it's a burden on the voters or the efficiencies involved. But you see that our job really is to try to make sure that whatever the manufacturers bring in from a voting machine perspective when it's used, it's going to work as designed, it's going to be accurate, and it's not going to insert something into the process that's not appropriate.
Well, my understanding is that in some of the localities where ranked choice voting has occurred, that to date, some of the tabulating really has to be done by hand or in a way that is not automatic. And maybe these new machines that you're testing will make that much more automatic and more reliable. But there is sometimes disagreement as to whether or not machines ought to be tabulating votes in the first place. Some people are actually advocating hand counting of the actual votes in order to ensure what they think would be more reliable, more confident outcomes. Does the EAC have any statistics on the error frequency difference between hand counting and tabulating by machine?
Well, machine counting is much more accurate than counting by hand. I mean, I think one of the arguments you just discussed regarding ranked choice voting is that oftentimes a jurisdiction will resort to hand counting because of the different stages of that process. And you can see that that extends the period of time of counting and getting results. Sometimes that's almost maddening. I mean, you can see where it takes a number of weeks or more to get results on the final winner, and it may change during the course of that period of time. And so it can be very frustrating to interested parties. And so that's only if you had to hand count every single ballot. And for example, I think in one of the recent Florida elections, there were 10 million ballots. And imagine trying to count that number of ballots with multi-pages and multi-languages. It would take months and months. And so I'm not sure the proponents of hand counting realize how long a process and how inaccurate a process it is. And in fact, when you look at some of the headlines from the mid-1900s, when they were transitioning from hand counts to a machine process, there was this national praise, or at least praise within the state, that they were moving away from hand counting that was ripe for fraud, for voter fraud and election fraud, and moving to voting machines that were taking this out of the hands of folks that might commit voter fraud. And so it's interesting that the machines saved the day going back into the mid-1900s and the 20th century. But today, some folks are arguing that we should move back to hand counting. And I would just say that hand counting is becoming increasingly limited because election administrators want to use a real ballot and have that tabulated into the system, because they recognize that having a number of ballots that are counted by hand will increase the inaccuracies of that process. And so it's ripe for error and it's ripe for potential election fraud. And that has been sort of the mainstay for decades until just recently.
Well, one final topic that has increasing currency is the concern about foreign interference in our elections systems and process. And then I conclude expert hacking of electronic information and data. Is this within the purview of the Election Assistance Commission? And if so, what is it doing about this type of threat?
So it is. And obviously, we were pleased with after 16, the Senate Intelligence Committee issued a report early 17 and said, look, we don't believe that any of the voting machines were compromised in any manner. We believe that the issues may be more with the voter registration systems or others, that there may be some vulnerabilities based on the fact that they're connected to the internet. But that being said, what are we doing about it? I mean, I think that the EAC we've passed the new security standards in VVSG 2.0, and we hope that the new voting machines will be even more secure. But one of the better things about the new standards is the increased auditability of it. And what I mean by that is it isn't just that it allows election officials to do audits of the ballots, but for example, if there is some pattern of activity of exploitation or attempted exploitation of a voting machine, we would be aware of it. The election administrator would be aware of it. The manufacturer would be aware of it. The voting machine itself would know that there was some attempt. And so that sort of requirement or capability on the voting machines, that you can understand how that adds an extra layer to this. We are doing more penetration testing of known vulnerabilities that are out there. You know, the technology changes. There may be a vulnerability just based on aging, and, you know, there may be some obsolete software. we are doing more penetration testing of our systems, going back to the 1.0 systems, the early systems, and now with the new systems. The big thing that we're doing is we are now looking at a vulnerability disclosure program. So this would allow some access to the systems by researchers, and so they could look for vulnerabilities in this modern era and provide that feedback back to the manufacturers. And so this would be a big deal. And as I talked with you earlier, and we mentioned this in the podcast, that the Congress was actually more concerned about those internet-facing systems like poll books and voter registration systems. So we are establishing a program of setting standards and testing for those systems. 20 years ago, all of the focus was on voting systems. None of it was on any of these other systems, right? And so now, as we sit here 20 years later, there's concern about, are our electronic poll books secure? Are our voter registration systems secure? We want to make sure that we do our due diligence in testing for those and certifying those for use, so the public is confident that we are looking at every possible scenario and systems and that we're protecting them. We see it as a national security issue. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our part that the Congress has instructed us to do in protecting those voting systems.
Has there been any evidence of attempted foreign penetration into any of these voting systems?
No, there has not been. And the few instances, like for example, the voter registration vendor down in Florida, in many ways, they did not even attack the electronic poll books themselves. They went after the manufacturer with a phishing campaign to try to exploit that office. And so it was an indirect attack, and that was the one that got a lot of headlines. But the answer from the Intelligence Committee and back in 2017 was that there was not a concerted effort that resulted in any exploitation of a voting machine, and that the results could be counted and we could be confident in the results. And so that was, the Senate Intelligence Committee making a statement, and they had reached out to a number of actors, including the EAC and others, in making that. But we have never received any sort of information that a first world country or other entity has tried to hack our voting machines. And when you look back at the latest midterm, 2022, and even back to 2020, some of the issues are like the state of Iran is trying to cause mischief and cause a level of deception into our voting process. And obviously the Russians were accused of that in 2016, but that is really the extent of it. I call it the dirty tricks complex, where they try to create dirty tricks in the election that would confuse and anger American voters. Our biggest concern, Jan, is that just as we saw in some Eastern European countries, let's say the Russians or the Iranians were able to penetrate an election night reporting, where the website or the election night reporting in a presidential election suddenly had the results inverted. And that doesn't really have an impact on the results themselves, but you can imagine the impact on voter confidence that a third party, an enemy of the United States, or another party was able to change the results, even if it's superficial. That would decrease voter confidence. And so we have determined that it may not impact the actual tabulation results, but we want to make sure that there's no disruption of the election process or the results reporting on election night or thereafter. And so we're going to do what we can, working with our federal partners, to increase the security of those systems, working with the states, obviously, because it may seem like a minor juvenile sort of an attack on our voting process, but it goes right to the core of voter confidence, and people across the country would be concerned about that. So we want to try to protect those systems as best we can and highlight the fact that sometimes our enemies will attack the most vulnerable just to make a point, right? It won't impact our election process, but they want to make a point by trying to hit us at our weakest and most vulnerable areas.
Well, I think you're hitting on the importance of the EAC. It is integral to the building of confidence on the part of the public and the voters in their voting process. A voter wants to go and cast a ballot and have confidence that the choice will be recorded, it will be counted accurately, and that the results will be accurate so that it will resist allegations of the sort that came out in the 2020 election. I mean, there were such outlandish claims of ballot fraud and irregularity that it's really unfortunate because it undermines that confidence, notwithstanding all of the steps that are being taken, not only by the EAC, but really the thousands of election administrators who are integral to making sure the process goes off faithfully and without a hitch. So it sounds like the EAC is doing its job. It's reinforcing the quality and accuracy of the way in which we vote. There's always other opportunities for things to go off track. You know, there might not be enough ballots in a precinct to accommodate the increased voting or other irregularities, but it'll be human error and temporary, and it won't go to the core of the process itself, which is so important. Well, as I do with all of my guests, when we wind up a good discussion like this, I ask what they are reading. What are you reading, or do you have any recommendations for our listeners?
So I just recently finished a book on the Abraham Accords. That really was something that transitioned in the Middle East, the growing peace between the Arab countries and Israel. And there was a book called Let My People Know, The Incredible Story of the Middle East Peace and What Lies Ahead by R.E. Lightstone. He worked with the U.S. ambassador to Israel and was an integral part of working with UAE and other Arab countries to sort of have that breakthrough on the latter part of the Trump presidency called the Abraham Accords. And I think that it was very interesting to me. You know, I like to read about foreign policy. I was an intelligence officer. So anything I can read about what's going on in the world and sort of how we could work toward peace in the Middle East, I wanted to share that book with y'all.
Well, thank you. Let My People Know is the title of the book about the Abraham Accords, obviously relating to the state of Israel, which I would just note is a country known for many, many close elections, especially recently.
Many elections, yes.
Maybe we can have a discussion about how they maintain the quality of their election process in that country someday. So thank you, Don Palmer, for your reading suggestions and for your time and insights on law and politics. Thanks also to our producer, Jody Mayer-Piazza, and to our sponsor, the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm. I invite my audience to enjoy listening to all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple, Google, or your favorite podcast streaming platform. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you will join us again on the next episode of Early Returns.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Barron. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.